Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
I'm Talli Rosenbaum.
And today we'll be talking about sex-positive instruction for new couples as they're about to get married, with an emphasis on the Kallot, the brides, although we certainly will also be talking about the instruction for men as well. In order to do that, we interview two different Kallah instructors, Dr. Hadassah Fromson and Dr. Yosefa Wruble, and we discuss how they integrate discussions about sexual pleasure and satisfaction together with promoting commitment to traditional observance. From their research and their experiences in teaching Kallot, they can demonstrate that religion and sex positivity are not contradictory, but are in fact complementary. We'll get to those interviews in just a moment. First, remember to check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikveh, checklist, and more. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, rate and review, leave a comment, and tell people about Intimate Judaism, and share the podcast so that we can continue to grow our audience. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. Make sure to visit jewishcoffeehouse.com and tallirosenbaum.com.
Our first guest today is Dr. Hadassah Fromson. Hadassah, we met recently at Limud. Scott and I were presenting, and you came to our presentation, and we came to your presentation, and I certainly was very impressed. So I'm going to say a few things about you. You're a lot of things. You know, you're Rebbitzin, and you're a Yoetz at Halacha, and you're a counseling psychologist, and you're a sex therapist. So that's a lot of different, yet I would say very integrated roles. And I know that you work both in private practice and you work with Kahn, which is an organization specifically for couples experiencing both fertility issues and sexual issues, and that you also are Madrichat Kallot, which is really very important to our topic today, which is sex positive sex education through Hadracha, through education by Kallah teachers. I would really like to hear more about what you presented on and about your research. So I'm going to let Scott start with the first question.
First of all, Hadassah, thank you very much for joining us today. It's nice to speak with you. I think before we do anything else, it's important to hear more about your doctoral research, specifically not spending too much time on it, because obviously that could be the entire half hour that we have with you. But what were you trying to discover, and what were the basic outlines of your conclusions?
Okay, so first of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you guys, both of you. It was good to put faces to voices, and it was great learning from you at Limud as well. So, as you mentioned, Talli, all of my different roles really kind of brought themselves onto each other. So I guess I started off as training as a Kallah teacher, and I was teaching a bride, and I was also starting my doctorate and wondering what should I write my thesis about. And I was very struck by I was teaching a lot of the hashkafic ideas of relationship and how sex is a very important part of marriage, but also that all the restrictions can also have a beneficial contribution to a relationship, and specifically a sexual relationship. And sometimes in some ways it can make it better in bringing all the beautiful ideas I'm sure you've covered in your podcast and many people will know. And she just looked at me and said, do you, with a face like, really, do you really believe that? Do you really believe like me not being able to touch my husband for 2 weeks is actually going to enhance our sexual relationship? And I kind of stopped, and I was a bit like taken aback, because I just had this assumption, right? This received assumption that this is true. This is what I learned. This is true. And I said, yeah, and I'm sure there's loads of research on how religion enhances sexual satisfaction. And then the joke was on me, because when I went to look for the research, it was really confusing, but also because there was people had lots of different conclusions, but also there was very, very little about what actually goes on within Judaism, because I was finding research about Christianity, about religion, but most of it was based on Christianity. And, if you're a Kallah teacher, one of the things you realize is actually we think very differently about sex compared to Christianity. So that was kind of the trigger for saying, well, let's find out what is going on with the Orthodox Jewish community and how does religion impact their sexual satisfaction. So, not necessarily the relationship, but specifically, how does it impact how much they're able to enjoy sex, all this stuff that we're teaching them. Is it true? And another thing that was also, when I started doing my research, that was missing was a wide scale study, a quantitative study that's looking at group norms and A lot of studies were based on, and including some of your very important work about, individual cases, which is very important. But there was we were missing group trends. So I went to basically recruit, and I managed to recruit, between 500 and 800 participants to an online questionnaire. I couldn't use all the data, not everyone completed it, and that was really interesting. How many people started and then didn't finish? How many people felt comfortable answering an online questionnaire about sex in the Jewish community? But essentially what I was looking at is I asked them questions about their religiosity. So this is, I know you don't want me to spend too much time on this, Scott, but this is actually I think an important point. How do we measure religiosity? What does it mean to be religious? So one I said is, well, how do people identify themselves? In what group do they see themselves? Are you ultra-Orthodox? Are you modern Orthodox? Are you non-Orthodox? And because even though people can be practicing religiosity and be religious, part of what affects them is the way their culture views things, and different people belong in different religious cultures. So I said, what group do you identify yourself with? And that was one measure. But the other measure which I used, which I think is a very powerful measure, it was a scale that's used across many studies, and this is important so that we can compare it to what happens in Christianity and Islam and non-monotheistic religions. And it's a very robust measure called the Centrality of Religiosity Scale. It looked at how intrinsically religious someone is. So it measures across 5 domains, intellect, ideology, public practice, private practice. How often do you pray? How often do you think about God? How often do you join in communal experience to do with religion? So it's not just about, what group do you identify with, but how engaged are you with your religion on a day-to-day basis? And funny enough, not they didn't necessarily match up, right? So not everyone in the ultra-Orthodox group was highly religious, although many of them were. And in the modern Orthodox group, as you might be able to guess, you got a 50-50 split between religious and highly religious, and some being non-religious. And in the non-Orthodox group, you had majority not religious, but some religious. And it shows how complicated I think it is when we define religion and religious belief and religious practice, how we view things versus maybe how people feel it on in their lives and bring it into their lives. And this was important because when we talk about hashkafa with madrachat in Hadrachat Kallah, when we're teaching people not just what to do, but what does the halacha and what does Jewish ideas and things that we learn in the Gemara and things that we learn about what to do and not to do, how does that impact our perspective on doing this mitzvah? And that for me is a very important part of the question. A lot of people ask me, like when I measured about sexual satisfaction, they're like, yeah, but when you're asking someone who doesn't have, a breadth of sexual experience, how can you compare that to someone who has lots of sexual experience? Like their sexual satisfaction baseline levels are going to be completely different. And I said, well, it doesn't really matter, because what matters is, are you satisfied? It doesn't matter, are you satisfied or do you have better experiences than everyone else? That doesn't lead to satisfaction. Satisfaction is an entirely subjective experience. So basically, I measured their religion, I measured their sexual satisfaction, all using scales, because that was very important that we had quantifiable data. And I also measured their sexual attitudes. And this is basically, I was measuring their hashkafa towards sex. And there was 3 main important variables. So one was permissiveness, the extent to which you promote and you think it's great to have casual relationship with sex, like the best kind of sex is the one with no strings attached. There was another variable called instrumentality, which is how much you see sex as a way to have pleasure for yourself, like you're using the other person to have pleasure for yourself. And the last one was communion, which is a bit of a confusing term, but it basically means how much do you feel sex is a way to really express love to you and another person. For example, one of the questions was, the highest form of sex is the merging of 2 souls. So this is what I mean. It was the hashkafic element, where people's attitudes towards sex, we wanted to see how it impacted their sexual satisfaction. So what I found in brief was, when you looked at the cultural religious groups, so ultra-Orthodox, modern Orthodox, non-Orthodox, and you said, is there a difference in sexual satisfaction amongst these groups? The answer is no, there wasn't a difference in sexual satisfaction. And I think that's really interesting for all sides to be aware of. But what I did see a difference in, when I looked at their religious practice, right? How intrinsic is their religion to them? How engaged are they in their religious beliefs and their religious practice? We found that the people who were in the highly religious category were significantly more sexually satisfied than the other groups. So that's both religious and non-religious. And so the big question is, why? What's going on here? So one of the things I looked at was, how does the data relate to each other? Using correlations, looking at the relationship between them. And what I found was that there were very important differences between the highly religious group, the religious group, and non-religious group. So and it was mostly in their sexual attitudes. So the most religious group, the highly religious group, had the highest levels of communion, belief in communion. So they felt that sex was more spiritual, so to speak, than the other groups. And they also had the lowest levels of permissiveness and instrumentality, that it was less about casualness and physicality. Whereas the other groups, so the non-religious group had the reverse, and the religious group was somewhere in the middle. So when I did a regression analysis, which is kind of to determine, like, let's just throw in all these variables and see what's the best predictor of sexual satisfaction, the variable that came up above all others was communion. And I was not expecting this at all. I actually was going down a different route in my thesis. I thought I was looking at sexual knowledge and thinking, like, how important is sexual knowledge? And actually that ended up not being so important, possibly because of the way I made the measure, but that's a separate point. What I was struck by was that communion, above all other factors, above religion, above other attitudes, was the best predictor for sexual satisfaction, and that tells us something about, which I think as sex therapists, we know that the attitude you have towards sex impacts the pleasure and the experience you have of it. And seeing it as something that more than just physical, seeing it as a way to connect to another person, that believing this isn't just, that we have a higher purpose here, that we're bonding in a way that's above other things. It's a special way, it's a spiritual way almost, leads to greater sexual satisfaction. And so I could go back to my Kallah and I could say, yes, with certainty, everything I'm teaching you will impact your sexual satisfaction in the positive.
There's so many questions that I have. And first of all, I really appreciate the research, and I really appreciate the research question. The initial question of, is it actually true that the halachot around Nidah and mikvah and the way that we live our lives enhance both marital and sexual satisfaction? But when you talk about high religiosity and the correlation between that and communion, and of course, the outcome of higher satisfaction, what I wonder about is, what would the effect be of variables such as the relationship? Because you can have high religiosity and belief in the importance of what you're doing, and that could fall under communion. The question is, what happens when that emotional connection is not necessarily there? And if you kind of looked at external additional variables and how they might mediate that relationship.
Yeah, so as I'm sure you know, it's endless what you could like try and control for, and it's so complicated. And when I'm talking about this, we're only talking about understanding, like, 13%, of being able to explain 13% of sexual satisfaction. And there are clearly so many other variables, even though that's actually quite a high indicator. One of the things I looked at was relationship duration. That's something I had to put in as a covariate, which means like it was something that was coming up as quite an important factor. How long has someone been married for? But I don't know. There's lots of I imagine that sex is meaningful only in a relationship you feel comfortable in, and in a relationship that you believe in. But at the same time, it's not all about sex. So it's not just an instrumentality. The communion aspect is looking at the connecting part. So fundamentally, it is measuring that relationship aspect. And I guess if someone could believe that, then if they're not experiencing, that's what the sexual satisfaction question was also looking at. It's not just so part of this was also the questionnaire was like, how good is your sex life? Like, how pleasurable is it? So someone would get lower scores if they didn't necessarily feel that in their life. And one of the other important parts of my study was I had some open-ended questions at the end where I was asking people, like, what were your expectations of sex and do they match your reality? And there was a mixed response, it's a mixed bag. And I think as a therapist, I'm very aware that I always I think everyone's got terrible problems because I only get the problems, right? And I see it getting solved, but I don't really hear about how many people are having healthy, functioning sex lives. And that's that kind of a bias I need to always correct. But I did see that there was a mixed bag. And I also saw that a big part of what people's expectations were when they got married of their sex life was for it to be a mutually loving relationship and one where there's deep care for each other. And that kept coming up as an important aspect. So, even though it wasn't necessarily something specifically studied, it's something that comes up as quite important.
Hadassah, I was struck when you described that difference between highly religious, and not religious, and having a more positive attitude or a greater sense of sexual satisfaction by the fact that, and perhaps I'm misunderstanding something, that doesn't necessarily correlate with the observance of Taharat HaMishpacha or Hilchot Nidah. And I wanted to know, because it sounds like when a Kallah teacher often, and this of course is anticipated by the Gemara itself, but when a Kallah teacher or a Chatan teacher says that keeping the laws of Nidah is a way of enhancing your sexual relationship and it will make it that much better, it's a new honeymoon every month, and so on, it sounds like your research didn't necessarily say that was true. It was more the fact that you're following anything, that you have the sense of communion with God, which can then be transferred into communion with the spouse. So I wanted to know if I'm misunderstanding that or if that's true.
No, you're understanding it entirely. And some people said to me, why didn't you ask if they kept? I didn't ask the question, did you keep Taharat HaMishpacha? Partly because I'm aware that for some people, Taharat HaMishpacha, they see it as this wonderful thing in their marriage. And for some people, actually, they hate it. They absolutely hate it. And it causes a massive bridge between them and their spouse. And they feel a huge distance in that time. And they don't feel the closeness that we all say, you should be like a brother and sister. And you should be able to get to know each other emotionally without physically. And I think when it comes to teaching kalot, so I spend actually 1 or 2 sessions almost talking about why keep halacha? What does halacha bring to our life? Because it's very hard to have just a list of do's and don'ts and think that this is a magic formula. Personally, my view is that halacha has to mean something to you. You have to think that, well, why am I doing this? What is this making me think of? What is it making me probe and think of in my heart, in my head? If it's what levels of what you can and can't eat. It's like thinking, okay, well, where's my gratitude about the things that I have, and how much can I control what goes into my body and my external influences? And the same when it comes to learning about Hilchot Nidah. I think just telling someone these are what you can and can't do, it would not be an efficient mode of teaching. And what you need to really focus on is almost like the step beyond that. Why do we keep this? What can we learn from these halachot, and what does it bring to our life? And a lot of people I particularly work with not so observant kalot, right? So they won't be keeping everything, but we spend a lot of time thinking about, well, what can you bring? Out of all these ideas that I'm teaching you, all these laws, right? How do they relate to you and your life? And how can you bring spirituality into your sexual relationship, into your marriage, based on the ideas brought of these laws, like with, safeguarding the sexual drive, and making sure that you have, with mikveh night, making sure that you have a date night scheduled in to make sure that you're really going to give time to each other. So making sure that there's that you're recognizing time doesn't just pass, that you're cognizant of your sexual relationship within time, and more importantly, that do you want to just be, when you have sex with your husband or with your wife, what are you doing? Are you bringing God into that relationship? Are you treating them in a holy way? Are you getting to really know them, right? Adam yada et chava ishto. What level are you getting to know them and their vulnerability? And for me, that's what the religious practice part brought in. It's how much do you think in a religious way? How much do you act in a religious way? And so probably for most people, that would mean that they had they would be keeping levels of Taharat HaMishpacha, but not necessarily. And we did see, so you can also have people who are doing all the right things, who are doing all the things that they're supposed to be doing according to the Shulchan Aruch, but they're not actually getting that satisfaction. They're not actually getting that religious benefit because they haven't integrated the ideas behind it.
In other words, if I can say back what you're saying, on some level, according to your research, it's not so much that separating for 2 weeks creates the sense of distance, which is then bridged together. It's more the fact that you're following the divine will, and that gives you meaning. The fact that there's ideas that you're able to draw from this, whatever the halacha might be, whether it's this or some other religious practice in theory, is probably, according to your research, more important than the specifics of Taharat HaMishpacha.
Yes, and this is something we see across fields of psychology now, that it's being called sanctification, the research of sanctification, right? So it's sanctification. What makes something holy, what makes something meaningful is the meaning you attribute to it. So, someone can make a bracha and drink a glass of water, and someone can be mindful and meditative over that bracha, and then they will feel more nurtured, and after drinking that glass of water, they'll have a spiritual elevation. So we know that it's not just about doing what you're supposed to do, although there is clearly reward for that, but it's more about how much are you taking in what the halacha is saying into your hashkafa? Like, how much are you seeing this as a way to live your life and bring meaning to your life?
The beautiful conclusion that we have is that the more connected you are, high religiosity means really believing in what you're doing. And I think that we know even in trauma recovery that having a strong spiritual belief creates resilience. But on the other hand, when religious, not values, but practice, and sometimes maybe even values affect or take away autonomy or agency, they can actually contribute to feelings of being out of control or oppression or victimization. So what I'm interested in here is we've spoken a lot on this podcast, and I think this most likely would not apply to you and many of the more modern, aware Kallah teachers. But we've spoken about situations where women are taught by Kallah teachers that, it's a mitzvah and they have to do it, and it's an obligation, and this is what you have to do, and you're not allowed to say no to your husband. And we've talked very much, and unfortunately, listeners to this podcast, that's going to still resonate with them. This idea that sex is something that you have to do. In the modern literature, it's called mate guarding, quote unquote, but we know it as not causing your husband to fail. I want you to comment on this kind of promotion of why it's so important to have sex and frequency of sex. Some sex therapists were just discussing on a WhatsApp the other day. Do Kallah teachers tell the women how frequently to have sex, and how this might, in fact, even contradict your role as a counselor, as a therapist, where you need to validate these actual failings or maybe even validate the issues that feeling oppressed by halacha or obligation create.
One of the things as you're talking that strikes me is how sometimes in therapy, people will come with many issues, whether it's oftentimes actually vaginismus for newlyweds, because they're nervous, they're scared, they can't, relax, they can't enjoy things, they're not letting the normal sexual arousal system work. And I think it's always very striking then when you think about, but surely the most important thing here is like the shalom bayit, the relationship. And fundamentally, God was willing to have his name with the Sotah erased for the sake of shalom bayit. And that comes up when we have, difficult halachic situations coming up, that comes up as a very important narrative. Obviously, the halacha oftentimes will be there to bring sensitivity of how to manage all these different important parts to it, because, as we've seen, completely having no guidance, being completely permissive, right? Completely seeing this as a physical thing and not a spiritual thing is actually associated with lower levels of sexual satisfaction. That is found out in my studies. So the religious parts do add to it, but it is a balance and it will depend on people. And I think when it comes to Kallah teaching, spending time on thinking about how people, are people on board, how on board are you with what is being taught here, and being able to have, as a Kallah teacher, the confidence to explore people's hesitations or people's nervousness, helping them integrate it within halacha and say and also working within halacha. So within, not everything, there are different degrees and levels of the laws within Nidah. And sometimes you have to be, it's like there's a chai bahem, right? We have to be a bit looser on some ideas in order to make sure that fundamentally we're not tearing this couple apart, that we're not putting them in a situation where it's untenable for them to live together. Because when they haven't had intercourse for 6 months or 10 months or 12 months or 14 months, what happens to the relationship as a result? Then you get into the cycles that she doesn't want to have intercourse with her husband and he starts feeling unwanted and desired and he stops reaching out to her, and this brings a whole breakdown into the relationship. And all of these factors have to be held together. That fundamentally the most important thing is that this couple can enjoy their relationship together whilst bringing spirituality, and it has to be manageable. Especially I think when people are anxious, they tend to almost cling on to halacha in a way to almost protect themselves from having to face certain things or deal with certain things. And as a Kallah teacher, who hopefully your Kallah teaching isn't just that, right before the wedding, but you'll maintain a relationship afterwards, it's important to be able to have an openness with your Kallah, to be able to deal with the difficulties that will come with marriage. Many of our brides, they will never have had a sexual relationship before, and this is their first time, and there's a lot to learn. And at the same time, knowing also when it's getting a bit too complicated to pass on to a therapist to deal with certain things.
Great. Thank you for that.
Dr. Hadassah Fromson, thank you very much for joining us today and for the insights that you provided. It was a short interview, but you really did pack it with a lot of important information, and we appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
We're now very pleased to welcome Dr. Yosefa Wruble to the podcast. Yosefa is a Ramit in the Migdal Oz Women's Beit Midrash. She hosts a weekly Parsha podcast for Matan. She's a Tanakh lecturer at Herzog College. She's an Ishmat certified Yoetzet Halacha, and she serves as a Madrichat Kalot. And actually, I know this personally because, Yosefa, you taught my daughter Talli before she got married, and I know that you also have a relationship with Talli Rosenbaum's daughter, Naamah. So welcome to the podcast.
It's a pleasure. I'll be honest. I'm a listener, so it's a pleasure to be here on the other side of things. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, that's great. We have connections on all sides. Your mother-in-law is Anna Wruble, who is my colleague. It's like we're one big happy family here. Amongst your many roles in being a Jewish educator is that you are a Kallah instructor. And I believe we had a conversation where you called me out on things that I had to say about Kallah teachers, Kallah educators, and kind of reminding me that, wait a second, the Kallah teachers today do a lot more sex education than in the past. So I thought it would be a really nice idea to kind of have you on and allow you to talk more about that. The first question I want to bring up just came up on a WhatsApp group that I'm on with Orthodox sex therapists, and they were asking if we thought the Kallah teachers suggest frequency of sex to their kalot and if they should be doing that. And I was wondering if you could start the conversation out by commenting on that.
Okay, so I promise I'll answer your question, but I want to take it one step back, which is that I do not speak for everybody. I'm only going to be speaking for myself and a few colleagues that I confer with because I respect their work. But this is a very it's a very broad range of people who become madrichot kalot. There's a certain degree of uniformity in how they receive their training, but ultimately it's really not. And there's a tremendous amount of wiggle room in what that role looks like. So I'll just tell you, I think in response to your question, that when I think of myself as a Kallah teacher, I think of myself clearly as obviously having to enable women to keep the laws of Nidah. But I really look at myself as a sexual educator, and I don't think that role is less important. If not, I actually think it's sometimes even more important, if I'm being totally honest, in terms of how I look at the instruction of kalot and their spouses, because I also meet with them together. So in terms of pushing a particular agenda, again, I will only speak for myself. I'm not part of any really big Kallah group kind of Kallah teacher kind of WhatsApp groups, to be honest with you, a lot of times because the things that come up kind of make me cringe, and I would... I don't really want to be part of those conversations, but I will just say that on a personal level, the only way that I address that question is that normal or normative really is a relative term. And we can, look at the Mishnah and Nidarim and look at how they sort of, I would say somewhat amusingly, reflect on the amount of times a couple should be intimate based on a man's occupation. But ultimately, the way that we'll reframe that today is that it has to be what is satisfactory in the eyes of the couple. That's, of course, involving two perspectives. It involves the degree of communication between them. So I cannot speak for all Kallah teachers. I can only speak that if I push anything, I simply push couples into realizing how much of a important aspect this is of their relationship, and that they should be putting in their best college try in making it creative, loving, and something that continues to develop.
Yosefa, I'd like to know, in a general sense, your feeling, and I realize, as you said, this is only your personal perspective on this. You can't speak for everybody, but from your perspective, what should the curriculum, if you want to use that term, what should the curriculum for Kallah teachers include? And I guess what I'm really asking is, how much should be the balance between learning Hilchot Nidah versus sexual education? How do you balance that?
Okay, so this is a great question. And I just see that in reality, it also depends on the training of the woman who's teaching, meaning how much she's comfortable, how much information she actually has to offer in each of those fields. I'll speak for myself because I do feel that I do teach in the way I believe, okay, which is that, first of all, when it comes to the relationship between the halachic instruction and the sexual instruction, I try and send a message from the first meeting that this is all one package, meaning you don't have Hilchot Nidah if you're not in a sexual relationship. And therefore, I would say pretty strongly against the whole save it for the end of the instruction kind of thing. The logic of madrichim and madrichot who do that is because I think kindly they want to feel like the woman is comfortable. And so they don't want to sort of probe into topics that they're concerned that they won't be comfortable talking about. I kind of take a different approach. And I believe that if you start from the beginning, and again, I'm a little bit privileged because a large majority of the Kallahs I teach, I knew beforehand, but not only. And I do this also for Kallahs that I didn't know before. I believe that you start from the beginning and that if it's and I say this to them, I'm very, very, very transparent with my kalot. I believe in that also just as a way of life. But from the beginning, from the first session, I'll maybe speak more about anatomy and physiology. And therefore, it's not quote unquote going to embarrass them. By the way, most of the Kallahs I teach, I don't feel they're embarrassed by much of anything, but I start from the very beginning. So in terms of the correlation between the sexual education and the halachic education, from my perspective, they go hand in hand. And that itself is a message for the couples, for their life. Again, I'll just speak from my own curriculum that I've put together over the years that I've been teaching, and I continually change and amend and learn. And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. But my goal, and everybody does this differently depending on how much knowledge they have to impart with the woman that they're working with. But my goal is to make her independent in her halachic practice, meaning, of course, I'm always here for questions, and that's the gift of also being Yotzat Halacha, but for her to feel confident ultimately in her halachic practice. And also within the sexual aspect, of course, it very much depends on how much sexual contact this couple is having before they're married. But basically, I do multiple units on sexuality for women, men, couple together, anatomy and physiology. I really have very clear, I do a whole session with young women on different methods of birth control, no matter what she's choosing at this current moment, because it's very rare that they'll be able to have that later on. Physicians don't have time to talk about that. So to me, it all comes together. I will say that I'll take your question from a theoretical perspective, which is that if I could recreate or re-envision how I wish this whole thing would go, I actually really wish that there would be a little bit of instruction. I would say like 2-3 sessions before a couple gets married, and then the bulk of it actually after they're married together. Because I just find, and we know in advance, that most of what we say on any realm goes in one ear, not the other. At best, they remember sort of like a warped version of what was said. And ultimately, it's really important that it be done together. So I've actually been shifting a little bit how I'm teaching. We could talk about that, but I think that on one hand, it's a real blessing that we have this stop along the way, that we do Kallah and Chatan instruction, because in other worlds, even in the secular world, they don't necessarily have education in the same formal way we do. So in some ways, there's an advantage to it. On the other hand, sometimes it could be so abstract for them that I'm not sure how effective it is.
Okay, so here's a few questions, and maybe I'll just put them together. One is, when you're teaching a Kallah, to what extent are you aware of how much of it is going in? You know, you mentioned that there's a lot of information and they may not necessarily be processing it. You said that most of your kalot are not embarrassed by much of anything, but what if there are kalot who really do have a lot of fear about what's going to happen, or may seem very, very uncomfortable with what you're presenting? What might you do in that situation? And also this idea of, do you or do you not present the possibility of difficulties, or do you idealize? So I was hoping that you could speak in general about this shift, also in terms of sensitivity, trauma history sensitivity, noticing if your Kallah is tuned off or dissociated because the information might be overwhelming. I don't think that every Kallah teacher does have the training to recognize that. Again, you're only speaking for yourself, so let's hear your wisdom in those areas.
Yeah, sure. Again, that emphasis, and I'm just speaking for myself, is very important. Okay, I'll start with, how do I know who I'm speaking with, right? So I ask questions. I ask very direct questions. Again, a lot of these women are women I know from beforehand, but not all of them. I will never start any sort of sexual conversation without asking directly if she's had any negative sexual experiences or sexual trauma. In the few times I've had it, in one case I knew in advance, and she was coming to me knowing that I would be able to be sensitive. And again, I always ask that. And I ask if the words I'm saying are okay. Are they comfortable with that? I let them know before I'm showing them a picture, right? I am, again, very transparent with them about what's happening. And in that regard, I would say that I get back about 75% transparency. And when I say 75%, I mean that I never ask details. I don't need to, because it comes out naturally. First of all, what this couple, what kind of experience they've had together, or they haven't had together, or what this woman has experienced in the past. How much can I know if she, again, if a Kallah is disassociating in front of me, I'm going to pick up on it, meaning I feel confident to say I have enough training as just a human interactor to know if that's happening. And I'll also, and let's say I'm thinking of one woman I taught in the past few years, and I saw that my sort of information giving approach, she was feeling a bit overwhelmed. And so I stopped and I said, where are you right now? Meaning, ultimately, it's not an equal dialogue, right? We have a lot more information to give than they have. So it's not going to be just a conversation all the time. The sessions always start out and there's conversation, there's schmoozing, but at some point there's going to have to be a little bit of speech giving, because it's not an equal conversation. And so, but I picked that up, and after the first session, she also said to me, I was very overwhelmed by that. And I said, okay, let's think together how we can make that less overwhelming, because we felt like the chemistry between us was good in terms of the dynamic as, Madrucha and Kallah, but she needed something to be changed. So I did change, and we did things slower. We did an extra session, meaning there was something she was a person who needed to process more slowly, and she was aware of that. I'll also say that I meet every woman after she's married, without exception. There is no such thing as learning with me without meeting afterward. I'm always available if they need to contact me, but I meet with them usually about 2 or 3 months after they're married. And that's purposeful, because I want them to have had a little bit more experience. Again, if something is wrong, they're going to be in touch most of the time. And so that's one thing, meaning it's never just going to sort of like fly under the radar, because I'm going to meet with them, and I'm also going to ask them pretty direct questions, and they're going to answer however they feel comfortable. And they already know that, because they've already been learning with me for so many hours before, that they're okay with that. In terms of your question about presenting difficulty, or the opposite spectrum of, do I sort of idealize? So you might have guessed that I'm not an idealizer. I don't present the definitely the chot as any sort of insurance card against any sort of marital troubles. I do let them know that that's a perspective, but I let them know that that's a perspective to say that it simply doesn't reflect the broad range of human experience of what it means to keep these halachot. So I'll sort of present it as like a dam ala hashiv kind of thing, if I can bring in that kind of nomenclature.
Know what to answer.
Yeah. Know that there's another perspective out there, but I'm not going in that direction. I do have appreciation. I think I do speak about sort of like a wisdom of the halachot that couples can sometimes really appreciate over the long run, but even couples over the long run won't necessarily appreciate it. And that's okay as well. But just to go back to your question about presenting difficulty, so I've actually shifted a little bit in this over the years that I've been teaching. I sort of felt like in the earlier instruction I got from all of the good places in the Jerusalem area that do this kind of stuff was sort of like, here's a list and here's all these different syndromes and things that can happen. And I kind of felt like I didn't love that approach, meaning I let them know very clear markers, like you shouldn't experience pain, right? And I let them know very clear markers, and let them know that there are things that can be difficult. These are all things that can be overcome. I do say specifically, I don't know if you want me to be specific here on the podcast, meaning I'll talk about all different versions of things that can, be either undesired or uncomfortable on the male side, or undesired and uncomfortable on the women's side. I steer really clear of, and I mostly teach in Hebrew, by the way, but I steer really clear of words like success and failure, of good or bad. I really try and explain there's such like a varied experience of what it means. And like, I don't feel the need to have to lock them in to these ideas that, let's say, people educating already are aware of. I'm to explain to them the difference between, intercourse versus a sexual relationship, because I want them to understand that these are not all the same things. Meaning I sort of already plant these kind of phrases, not assuming that they're going to get locked into, let's say, a particular sexual script. And so I try and the education is also, they're not even aware of the fact that, I'm saying that I'm already presenting it differently than how other people might be experiencing it or heard of it. So I do speak about difficulty, but I don't like to over pathologize. I think that it can have a sort of a problem in and of itself of doing that. But I let them know that there are, things that shouldn't happen, or that there are some sort of boundaries of what already is going into something that maybe, should require either pelvic floor, physical therapy, or again, and I let them know that most things, really almost everything, it should be dealt with. And there's great people out there. And I'm here to sort of be a go-between with you and those kind of professionals. But I don't like to over present the syndroming, well, while they know that there are boundaries to what is normative.
I'm curious about something which I, as a Chatan teacher, have often struggled with, and our previous guest, Hadassah Fromson, alluded to this as well, and that's how you present kulot, leniencies in halacha, to a new Chatan or Kallah. In other words, I'm not referring necessarily to issues where there's a debate whether this is asur or mutar, whether something's allowed or prohibited, but I'm talking about a couple that you suspect, for example, may not keep the laws altogether. They might keep them to a certain degree. And at what point do you say, this is a Torah law, this is a rabbinic law, and at what point do you say, I'm just going to present them all as one big entire system and let the chips fall where they may? I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense, 100%. First of all, it depends on who I'm speaking to, okay? Again, I largely know pretty well the women I'm teaching at this point. And so whether or not, let's say, they're being makpid on shmirat negiah or very much not so, it's not necessarily at all correlated with how they perceive themselves as keeping Hilchot Nidah afterwards. So first of all, I never want to underestimate people's halachic observance, meaning it's really difficult. It's probably one of the worst ones out there, right? Couples dating for a long time. It's just not a great situation for all different reasons. And so but that isn't necessarily correlated with their general hakpadah, or how much they want to observe, or how fully they want to observe the laws of Nidah. So first of all, I don't assume negative things. That's first of all. I don't assume a lack of observance. I think that really the only topic that this comes up in a very clear way is when it comes to presenting harchakot. I do not think that there's a need to present other halachot very differently. Again, will people be makpid on counting their own prisha? I don't know, but I'm still going to teach it because that's my responsibility as a halachic educator to put the information out there. I'll speak about a colleague of mine, Shana Goldberg, who you both know, and she has so many stories of people who she did not think that they would ever be keeping, and she was debating, should I teach or not teach? And she did teach, and in the end, they decided that they were going to keep those halachot. So I'm not really a fan of underestimating people's halachic dedication, because I also find that couples can be even different in their dedication to laws regarding their sexual relationship than they are even in other realms. And that could be both that they're more or less observant of them, depending on where they fall in that. So, but when it comes to harchakot, I am aware that this is a very, very difficult element. And I put that on the table, again, not presenting it as negative, but say, this is something that couples will often struggle with. I do create a certain degree, if I know that it's a couple who I think may not end up keeping, right? Meaning it's not super clear to them that there's no difference for them. They're doing everything, until the end. Then I will present a little bit of, here are, let's say, the 4 or 5 core, I would say almost doraita harchakot, and then I explain that the others are just as binding halachically if you're an Orthodox Jew who believes in, hilchot rabbanan. But I do explain that there is a slight difference. What I do also say to them is that honestly, the ones that sit at the core are the ones that people usually struggle with, meaning not, sleeping in separate beds and touching, and not necessarily differentiating into different kinds of touch in the halachic language, are the ones that are very difficult for people. So I'm not even so sure how much it always helps. But I try and sort of strike a balance between knowing who I'm talking to, not underestimating them, and also letting them know, if I think, in any couple, letting them know that we have to use our brains also and our common sense, and that there is a certain degree of difference. But if you're committed luckily, then this is all sort of part of the same package. But obviously you have to utilize your common sense and your understanding of each other when it comes to, let's say, really difficult situations and how this interplays.
The name of our episode is Sex Positive Hadracha. And sex positivity generally refers to, first of all, normalizing various desires. People always want to know, am I normal? that I want to do this or that this interests me. And also about pleasure, talking about pleasure. I'd like to know what makes your hadracha sex positive. What are the important sex positive ideas and values that you try to teach in your Kallah trainings?
Okay, I'll try and make this not too long. First of all, I am a big believer in the energy that you put out. And I think that someone who sits down to teach a woman or a couple and you can feel in the way she teaches that she is not particularly comfortable with these topics, that comes across. The couple may not be able to verbalize that, but it comes across. So the first thing is a nonverbal, which is that this is a part of life, couples and couple health and a positive relationship with our bodies and our sexual relationship is something that is an area itself of positivity. That's an area of exploration and creativity. I both say those things, but I also really believe them. And so I do believe that that is something that will ultimately come across when I teach. I think that the fact, as I said before, that it's sort of in almost every meeting, there's going to be talk about the sexual life of a couple is another piece of it. Again, the emphasis on continued growth, the emphasis on a couple learning together and exploring together is something that I speak a lot about, meaning I both, as you said, normalize different scripts and different realities and different reactions. But that I also put a tremendous emphasis on making sure that this is a pleasurable part of their lives. And my Kallahs know that, meaning, again, it is a direct question that I will ask them when I meet with them after they're married. I will ask them directly, are you experiencing orgasm? If they're not, and we speak about different kinds, I'm certain that I offer more information than a lot of other Kallah instructors. And again, some of it is Chinese, right? Some of it the Kallahs don't get, some of it they may get because they have their own experience. But I will speak about it again afterwards. And in addition, I have a group, a sort of a broadcast group on WhatsApp that my Kallahs are in. And I send things every once in a while, not super often, but let's say once every 2 months. And it could be a conference or a book, and it's always something relationship and or sexually oriented. And it's also just to remind them that I exist, because no matter how much you say you're here to help, people feel alone when they're struggling and they forget that people have offered to help. It's just a psychological reality of the way people function. And so they know that I am always learning, meaning I just did a course with someone that I love, Einat Liv, whatever. She's a wonderful, she called herself like a gyno philosopher or something like that. And I did this really great course with her. And I sent it on the broadcast group. And I said, I did this course. She has amazing language, and I try and just be open and say, look, we're always learning. And I sort of put that out as, I said to them, if you're going to get your teeth cleaned once or twice a year, you definitely should invest in reading one book or listening to one podcast a year in your sexual life. Meaning, other than also having open conversations, this is a part of our life that we can grow in. And sometimes we have all the resources we need inside, and sometimes we also need to reach out there. So to me, like, continual growth is associated directly with me with sexual positivity. And I really hope it's true that any woman who reaches out to me, who calls me, whether she was a Kallah I taught or a woman who I speak to for as a Yosefa Halacha, that is an attitude I hope that I always exude, meaning she's always normative. There's always someone to talk to. And I'm so happy that you called so that we can sort of figure this out. And if you need to go somewhere else, we can find you the right address to go to. But I feel, again, that positivity is both in what you say, and it's also a lot about the way you respond to people and the energy that you put out there. So that's something that I can only be honest with myself about, of making sure that it's a positive part of life, and that it's continually something that's being developed. I'll just say one other thing, which is about the couple itself. There are a few madrichot that do all hadracha together. I think that there's a real advantage on having a one-on-one with the woman, and I think there's a real advantage to having a one-on-one with the man. I think that the questions of tzniut are important questions, and a madricha who doesn't feel comfortable should not put herself in a situation feels uncomfortable with. But I have begun to feel over the past while that I had a little bit of enough of only speaking to one side. And while the couples I am teaching are very communicative, and I hear lots about their conversations, and I do feel that they, they have wonderful communication between them. And honestly, like every time I meet another couple, I'm always kind of like moved at the men we're producing in the world today. I have 4 daughters and now only a baby boy, so I haven't yet done that. I haven't brought a boy to a bigger age yet, but they're great guys. I'm really so moved by them. But I've come to a place where I'm also been doing, I always do a session with a couple together about their relationship, about some of these messages. And I've also started doing one session also about sexuality with the couple together, meaning, again, the woman will receive more private instruction, but to speak with them together, because I just feel for so many reasons that it's important, obviously, to provide, common ground of conversation and terms. And also because I found, and I guess you'll see if you want to edit this out, but women aren't always their own best advocates. And if they have a husband who realizes how available there is someone for their wives to talk to, sometimes they'll actually push their wives to speak to somebody sooner than she would have if she would have been left to her own devices. So I actually kind of want to bring in the man on that front as well. And I think that there as well, like you see somebody who's speaking comfortably, openly, positively about all these topics. And I think that itself is important. And ultimately, we're only responsible for trying to bring them from point A to point B, meaning I'm only working with what I'm being given. I'm not. And so that's my goal, is to take them a step beyond where they are at the current moment.
That's great. Thank you.
Yosefa, we have time for one more question. I wanted to ask, on behalf of perhaps some of the Kallah teachers who are listening to this, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing that many Kallah teachers have not been trained as extensively as you have, and others that are your colleagues have been trained in the areas beyond halacha. Some of them might just be the Rebbetzin of a shul. Some of them maybe teachers in a high school, teachers in a seminary. What would you recommend to a Kallah teacher listening to your words right now who says, I just don't have the training to do that? What can I do in order to transmit the messages that I want to transmit and that need to be transmitted to my kalot without saying something damaging, which can happen when you're not trained in that area?
Okay, this is an excellent question. And I think it depends also, let's say, on where somebody's living. Meaning, if someone says to me, I don't have these skills, Yosefa, but I live in the Jerusalem, Gush Etzion, Beit Shemesh area, so I would send you to one of the organizations that exist in the area that can give training, right, for Madrichot Kalot. And again, I would also say that a lot of what I say to couples and what I teach, I would say a portion of it comes from the courses, but I did a lot of reading and studying on my own. So ultimately, it never replaces your own study. I'm happy to there's some great books out there. I would say on a popular level, there's Emily Nagoski's Come As You Are, which is a great book with some great phrases. She has some great TED Talks as well. There are Christine Northrup books, which is Our Bodies, Ourselves, I believe. Sorry, it's called something else, but her big magnum opus on women's bodies, that's not directly related to Kallah teaching, but I think it gives a particular gestalt of sort of the organic nature of our mind-body relationship, which is so central to our relationship with our sexuality. I think if you want to teach women who have been sexually abused, then there are trainings that are done from a bunch of organizations that have that. And I think that if you live in some random location and these are not relevant for you, then there are courses you could take in human sexuality, right? Again, depending on if you're religiously comfortable with that, but you can go into university and just take a course on human sexuality. There's websites that also sort of online universities you can take a course in. Those are all good options. And again, I would say that it's a lot of books. I also will credit in my earlier years, let's say the first year that I started teaching, I sat down with my mother-in-law for many hours, and she sort of gave over a lot of what she used to teach in her lectures. That was sort of the beginning of the path. But again, there's a lot of books out there, and I'm also just a curious person. So when I meet professionals that I value, I also ask them, like, what's your reading list? What are you looking at? And I also want to say this, that I don't think that every Madrichat Kalot has to be some sort of professional. Again, I have my very clear boundaries. I'm not a sex therapist. I'm not a couples therapist. I might meet a couple for troubleshooting. Let's say, after they're married, I definitely can, meaning do meet them or have phone conversations, but it never goes beyond that, meaning I'm very clear on my limits. And that's also very important. And so I think that, like, there are certain markers though, that to me, like, I don't think that Kallah teaching should be allowed to happen if they're not including anatomy and physiology, conversations about sexual pleasure and orgasming, conversations about the reasons why a couple will decide to be physically intimate with each other, right? What does that process look like? Or what sometimes is called the sexual response cycle. Meaning there's some like basic ideas that to me, you can't have Kallah teaching without them today. I said that I look at myself as a sexual educator. I think that the role of being a madrich and madrichat kalot, largely, it needs to be, a significant portion needs to be to look themselves as a sexual educator. That being said, it's okay that not everybody has the same amount of knowledge, meaning ultimately the Kallah has picked this person, or the Chatan has picked this person, and they'll be able to grow from there. Meaning I also like to put a lot of faith in the couple to say, like, this is yours. You're going to grow with this. Meaning this, if you are having trouble, then there's people to talk to. Obviously, there's the books, Talli Rosenbaum's books that she's put out. And I would even say sometimes these are nice books. Let's say the Jenny Rosenfeld and David Ribner one that could be nice to give to a couple if that's where the couple's holding, that they could read it individually or together. Those are also important, meaning there are sometimes you can give that responsibility to a certain degree to the couple themselves. But I think those sort of broader topics that I mentioned are points that really have to be hit on in basic instruction. And I'll put one other piece in there, which is that I can't believe I didn't always do this, but I have models that I use, meaning I have models of the female genitalia, of the male genitalia. Like I order them from a woman who specially sews them so that they're like beautiful and aesthetic and loving. And that's also really a really nice dimension. And it also exudes positivity without even having to say it. And it also just, sometimes the instruction is so amorphous for couples, even couples who are not Traumanegia. And so I've found that sort of being clear and having a clear model that we're looking at in front of us is also really, really helpful to making things be clearer and just, making it be clearer for the couple.
Dr. Yosefa Wruble, thank you very much for joining me and Talli today on Intimate Judaism. This was a very enlightening and informative conversation. You brought so much to the table, and I'm sure our listeners feel the exact same way. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And thank all of you as well. Check out the website, intimatejudaism.com, for our archive. Subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcast. Continue sharing Intimate Judaism. Join us on Patreon. Write to us at intimatejudaism@jewishcoffeehouse.com. We'll see you next time.
Bye.